The topics that we are going to cover is the outsourcing, one of the most important and interesting facts. India became one of the favorite destinations in terms of outsourcing. The World Trade Organization, WTO, was founded in the year 1995. Every single activity that is being done has got the maximum value, has growth and employment, a very, very important and an interesting aspect altogether. Good morning and welcome to the third session of Liberalization, Privatisation and Globalization. It's a very, very important and interesting concept altogether which we need to learn, and this session will provide you an insight into what are all the services sector and the manufacturing sector took together to make the Indian economy the most formidable economy in the world. So moving forward, let's look into what are the topics that we are going to cover today. The topics that we are going to cover is the outsourcing, one of the most important and interesting factor that we have spoken about. The World Trade Organization, WTO, also in terms played a very pivotal role in guiding the economy. The Indian economy during reforms, we are going to look into an assessment, the growth and employment, which was very much needed for India, and we are coming up as one of the most favorite nations in terms of employment. Reforms in agriculture, yes, we did not forget our backbone. We did some amount of information towards the agriculture. Reforms in the industrial sector, disinvestment, and the reforms and the fiscal policies altogether. So these are some of the most important topics that we are going to look in for today. Moving forward, we're going to talk about outsourcing, one of the most interesting factor. This is the most important outcomes of globalization. Why? In outsourcing, a company takes a measure of outsourcing its products, outsourcing its core services in terms of finding out which are all can be given to other nations in terms of growth, in terms of employment altogether. So for example, a company in America feels that there are certain services which can be done in India at a cheaper cost or a cheaper rate and can be also done effectively. Then the American company will outsource its functions to India, thereby providing employment and also improving the IT-enabled services or that sector altogether. Now, there are many other factors which you look in outsourcing. For example, if you start looking legal advisors, computer services, advertisement, securities factors, so many things are being today outsourced to India where they feel that there is enough skilled employment and people who can guide and take this particular sector to the next level as far as possible. So outsourcing became the most in thing. After the year 1996 onwards, India became one of the favorite destinations in terms of outsourcing, and which gave out to a new industry altogether called as the BPO, which is known as Business Process Outsourcing. The second factor, as a form of economic activity, outsourcing has intensified in the recent years because we have skilled employment, we have the resources, we have the talent, and we also know how to manage and maintain the entire system so that the growth of information technology can also be enhanced. Many of the communication processes, many of the outsourced processes can definitely add great value to the Indian continent altogether. So moving forward, the World Trade Organization, WTO, was founded in the year 1995 as an outcome of GATT. After the GATT was over, the successor was WTO. GATT was established in 1948. Now, what does GATT stand for? General Agreement on Trade and Tariff with 23 countries, but now WTO has got 195 countries as a member there, and GATT's ideology was to provide equal opportunity for trading for every single country in the world. So GATT was a kind of establishment which was created in order to integrate the world as one single economy altogether. But however, when WTO got established in 1995, a rule-based trading regime which nations cannot place arbitrary restrictions on trade. The WTO's ideology was very simple. They did not want any country to dominate the other country. They did not want any nation to place restrictions on other country and hold back. They wanted the system to be transparent and efficient as far as possible, because only with that we will be able to grow an economy as quick and as better as far as possible. So WTO became a factor of enhancement. WTO became a factor through which you could start accessing the globe in terms of trade and investment. Moving forward, the WTO also had a very important purpose to enlarge the production and trade to ensure the optimum utilization of the world resources. So WTO's ideology itself was very simple. They wanted to see that every single activity that is being done has got the maximum value, has got the maximum utilization of a resource altogether. They did not want to give up things so easily. So what happened here was that they wanted to protect the environment altogether. The WTO's agreements was to cover the trade of goods and services as well as to facilitate the international trade, the bilateral and multilateral agreements, as well as the non-tariff, the trade factors, all those kind of things, because they did not want this tariff to become a matter of importance, a matter of barricade that could stop the nations. WTO's ideology was to create an open free trade economy through which all the countries can come forward. They could start trading as a common place, and each and every country could make the best use of resources that are available in the other. So he wanted to be a trade facilitator and not a trade barricade. So that is why the role of WTO in enhancing the Indian economy also plays a pivotal role. Now, moving forward, WTO as an important member, India has also been therefore having a lot of factors. It has also got a lot of opportunities and the rules and regulations to safeguard in terms of providing a lot of opportunities to trade and do different factors in terms of trading. Now, it has also kept in its commitment towards liberalization, and it has followed the guidelines of WTO. We have also tried to understand how to make ourselves more liberalized, how to break open our economy, how to come up with the best factors, and where are all that we can concentrate and start developing our economy altogether. So this is why I would say WTO is one of the most important tools, most important happening factor that led to the guidance of the economy. Now, moving forward, the factors of reforms which I would like to talk, especially during the assessment period, Indian economic during the assessment period. Our reforms were something like this. We has completed 1.5 decades since our reform. So today, if you start looking from 1991 till 2020, if you start looking here, we have almost completed more than 2.5 decades. So it's almost like 3 decades, I would like to say here. And the growth of an economy is measured by the gross domestic product. In the year when we were somewhere around 1.2 to 2.4 where the GDP, we almost progressed up to 9.8% GDP. We have seen that numbers coming up to India. So definitely Indian economic reform went up very well comparatively altogether. The growth of agriculture and industrial sector has seen a tremendous opportunity, tremendous growth because of opening up of the economy. I would say the last 30 years has been a golden era for India, trying to come up with new areas, new sectors, and opening up of the services industry, which has provided great employment opportunities across the globe. And it also indicates that the growth can be mainly driven by the service sector. When the service sector was introduced in India, hardly the contribution was less than 10%. But today, if you look at the services sector, they contribute quite close to 46% of India's revenue. So we have gone very high in terms of service sector. And it is not only in the IT area, probably even in logistics, in e-commerce. If you start seeing that we have been able to provide fantastic service, we have been able to provide fantastic growth altogether. And this is an upcoming nation with a lot of ideas, a lot of innovation innovations altogether. The 10th plan, that was in the year 2002 to 2007, was projected that India's growth rate was at 8%. So imagine, once upon a time when we were just at 2%, we went all the way 4 times up to 8%. So that was a great trajectory growth that you could see in the Indian economy. Thanks to the 5-year plan, because every 5-year plan was modulated at growth, every 5-year plan was targeted at some particular event, and that's how we started coming up as a nation altogether. In order to achieve such a high growth rate, the agriculture, industrial and services sector had to grow at a rate of about 9.5, 9.1, because we were targeting the core economic sectors to grow well and to promote, so that the Indian economy starts moving up at a higher rate altogether. So that's why we started believing that the growth needs to happen at all possible levels altogether. So this is what we have done and we have created as an economic sector altogether for the entire development. So really we need to appreciate this factor, that how we have been able to project and bring the economic growth altogether in terms of our development. Moving forward. However, some scholars have always raised an opinion or apprehension in terms of projections of such a high rate because of the unsustainability. No doubt about it. Why? Because when a country starts growing at a high rate of development, when we talk about the double-digit growth in GDP, there has been problems, there have been challenges in asking this question: will we be able to sustain that growth? Is it possible that every year you can project a 10% growth on GDP? Has always been a question mark. But still, we have tried to keep our words, we have tried to keep our promises, and we have been projecting at a great rate altogether. It has been seen that as a successful exporter of auto parts, engineering goods, IT, software, textiles, these were some of the areas where we have not failed, and we have been constantly improving, innovating ourselves to become the best provider in the worldwide. And we have also benchmarked ourselves with some of the best practices, the global level altogether, and today we have reached to this level. Now the rising prices have also been kept under control. That's a very, very important factor. Why? Because if you start seeing that many price factors, many of the prices that have been rising up, the inflationary mode altogether has been brought down, and this has helped the growth of the economy to a very great extent. On the other hand, if you see, the reform processes have been widely criticized for not being in terms of able to address the basic problems facing our economy. That's primarily in the rural sector, but not to worry, because if you start looking at the economy after 2007-2008, the focus again went back into rural India, and we started promoting those small towns and villages. And today, if you start looking, India has got a fantastic inroad in terms of the rural economy growth. In fact, the SME sector, the small, medium, micro enterprises, have been grown to such a large extent, contributing to over 40% altogether. So we have done even on those areas, and we have done a lot in terms of electrification, roads, railways, hospital, education and other sectors, which has promoted those villages and the 2-tier and 3-tier cities. Similarly, we are also now trying to focus on agriculture, infrastructure and the fiscal management. Why? Because we are now really concerned about growing up as a very well integrated nation and standing as a benchmark for other nations to understand and develop the policies altogether. Now, moving forward. Growth and employment, a very, very important and an interesting aspect altogether. Though the GDP rate has been increased in the reform period, most of the experts point out that the reform-led growth has not generated sufficient employment opportunity. We need to agree with this point. Why? Because if you look at the employment rate in India, the employment grew only in the services sector and not in the core manufacturing or the agriculture sector. The shift in the movement of agriculture towards manufacturing and then towards the services had led to the growth only in a particular sector. Especially if I say the IT sector, the information technology sector, saw a rapid growth in employment. But the other sectors were not able to pick up this much in terms of providing employment, because of which the overall unemployment level still in India is quite close to 20 to 10% altogether. So we see about 10 to 20% of unemployment happening in our country. This is a very, very bad scenario, but yet we will be able to overcome it. We will be able to see that we are able to make a better progress altogether. Now, the reforms in agriculture, of course, agriculture has always been the key center of growth for us, and we have been able to see that after the 1980s, we did lose focus on agriculture, but then the reforms at the current scenario has been placing towards it. But then when we go through the economic shift or change, reforms have not been able to benefit agriculture. Why? Because agriculture lost importance after 1991. The focus shifted towards financial, manufacturing and services and not in agriculture. So that was the reason why we had put a pause button on agriculture. We were not able to progress faster onto it. And then the public investment in agriculture sector, especially on infrastructure like irrigation or water supply factors, electricity, also started dipping down because they started concentrating on the urban growth altogether. So that was probably one of the areas where you see that the agriculture had to take a back seat. But not to worry, in the coming agriculture policies and things that have been set across, the agriculture factors are moving extremely good, extremely strong altogether. Let's move forward. The reforms in agriculture that we have started seeing is that the removal of fertilizer subsidy, one of the best things that the government has ever done, which was actually severely affected the small and marginal factors. And that was one thing where India had to bring in the rules and regulations to help the farmers. Moreover, since the commencement of WTO, this sector has been experiencing number of policy issues. Probably, there was a lot of change in the agricultural duties, the exports, the values and other factor. So India had to rework on the agricultural policy, bring back a lot of stability and a neutralization on the agricultural sector altogether. There has been, if you start looking at the quantitative restrictions on the factors that have been going on, and it has affected the Indian farmers to a great extent, especially on the capital infusion, especially on the fertilizers and other factors. But then government has always taken steps to protect the farmer, the land and the ownership rights. Moving forward. The reforms in the industry, definitely not to worry that the globalized world, the developing countries have compelled that their economies are in the position to change and they need to bring in better reforms in the industrial sector. So greater inflow of goods, greater inflow of the exports have all started looking and making their industries vulnerable to imported goods. Why? Because now if you start looking at India itself, in the last few years, we have been dumped with the Chinese goods altogether because China was producing more than India and China wanted to see India as a dumping ground and not as a collaborative partner altogether. So the vulnerable part of this growth story is that most of the developed nations look at the developing nations as dumping grounds. They just want to throw back their products here, so that needs to be restricted and that needs to be equalized altogether. Cheaper imports have thus replaced the demand for domestic products, because of which the domestic manufacturing industry and the manufacturers have been severely affected. That is why when we bought in the plan of Make in India and Make for India, we wanted to see that at any given point of time, India is not affected by the cheaper imports. India is never affected by the imports coming from different parts of the world. So that is why at any given point of time, the domestic manufacturing plants have to be improved to give a consistency in terms of growth. This is highly, highly important at this given juncture, at this given point of time. Now, moving forward. The reforms in the industry also started focusing on the infrastructural facility, including power supply, and at any given point of time, due to the lack of investment in power, the affiliated services, there was a breakdown. But today, if you start seeing opening up of power sector, opening up of the renewable energy, opening up of facilities have helped the industrial sector to start moving up. So we are now not just focusing on manufacturing, we are also focusing on the allied sectors which are supporting this industry to grow altogether. Similarly, globalization is often seen as creating conditions for movement of goods and services from foreign countries that adversely affect the local countries. Using globalization as a key, many of the foreign countries have tried to take advantage on the less developed countries trying to push their products, trying to push their policies and practices. That is where globalization had a very big drawback, and that is where it drew a flag from many of the people. But then what we need to look at a positive thing is that globalization has also made those smaller countries to open up and start addressing the issues of the economy. So it has got both sides in order to look into in terms of the economic development. Moving forward, we are also going to see about this word called as disinvestment. What was this disinvestment? As I told, disinvestment is for the PSUs which are not performing. For instance, in 1991-92, it was targeted to mobilize 2,500 crores through disinvestment, a very, very important factor altogether. Why? Because by 2,500 crores, the government of India could get this as a revenue altogether. Critics point out that the assets of PSUs have been undervalued. So there could have been an instance where you would see that the performing PSU would have also been undervalued, would have not been given that importance at all, and sold to private sector. So the private sector was at an advantage, at a beneficial position where you could just take over companies at a cheaper rate. And there has been a substantial loss to the government. Yes, there have been times when government did not make a very good return on investment. They just had to sell that industry and get the money. Moreover, the proceeds from disinvestment were used to offset the shortage of government revenues. So what government did is that in order to overcome the shortages in terms of the fiscal expenditures and other policy, this money was utilized there, and government had used it not so effectively. Rather, they just used it to manage their own expenditure. So most of the economists and experts point out that the disinvestment policy in India has not been followed correctly, has not been given due importance, and people always felt that the disinvestment has not been used in the development of infrastructure. So one key area that we need to address at any given point of time is how to make the disinvestment even more effective altogether. Now, moving forward, we also need to understand the reforms and the policies that we have been talking about, especially in the growth of public expenditure, the tax reduction methodology, reform policy involving the tariff reduction, and in order to attract the foreign investment altogether. There has been a negative impact on development and the welfare expenditures also. Why we are talking about these things is that if you look at the public expenditure and the tax reduction, these are two things which are quite contradictory altogether. If you reduce the tax, the expenditure will go up, we will not be able to match. If we increase the tax, that impacts on the consumer altogether. So somewhere the government had to strike a balance to see whether they are able to match revenue to expenditure. The other thing that you would start seeing is that the government policies curtailing the tariff and the scope of growth altogether, because through customs, the revenue that was generated was also trying to get hit because the government wanted to break on the tariffs altogether. And attraction of foreign investment through tourism, through manufacturing, through the MNCs companies was also one of the things that was needed for India in order to promote. There was some negative effect on the developmental and welfare expenditure. Why? Because the internal society development, especially when it comes to education, healthcare, women and child development, there has been a negative impact because these social aspects and social indicators, India did not concentrate well at the beginning. Today we have come up with a lot of welfare and policy measures in order to empower the women, empower the child, and upbring the education altogether. Moving forward, we come to the conclusion of this session of the chapter. The economy's factors that we have been talking about, the problems of declining foreign exchange, that was the major thing that we were talking about. India had changed its foreign policies. That was a need that was coming with the new economic policy. In the major factor that we had brought out was the major reforms that we brought in terms of industrial reforms, the financial sector reforms. So the domestic sector started seeing an entire shift in terms of appreciation, in terms of growth. and with the view of improving the performance. This word is very, very important in public sector. There was a consensus of making the public sector more proactive, sell off all those assets which were not performing. So on the whole, this chapter provides us a view of how India was able to transform the economy, moving forward from a slow growth economy to a dynamic economy altogether. And last but not the least, the globalization definitely helped us and provided us the mean to grow together. Almost the outsourcing part and everything became very, very important for us. The objective of the WTO was to establish the rule-based trade regime that also was taken care into the factor. The reforms of agriculture, the reforms in terms of the industrial factors, and the reforms in terms of the domestic factors also helped our country to make a great change altogether. Though the agricultural sector was not really benefited, industrial sector was able to see some sort of growth. With the introduction of services coming into the picture, we made a rapid change, a rapid growth altogether. This is very, very important, and this definitely made our sector grow forward. So with this, we come to the conclusion of today's session. Thank you once again for joining me on this interesting session. I hope and believe this session would have made a difference in terms of knowledge, in terms of the intellectual output that you have gained in liberalization, privatization, and globalization. Thank you once again for joining me today.